Hey guys, welcome aboard to Just Sleep Stories, the only channel where history nerds and insomniacs unite in perfect, slightly confused harmony. Tonight we are going somewhere genuinely strange. Not ancient Rome, not medieval castles, not a pirate ship reeking of salted fish and poor decisions. No, tonight we're visiting a small, modern and frankly very sensible country that looked at the entire war on drugs, all the arrests, the overflowing prisons, the overdoses, the corruption, and said, you know what? What if we just didn't? What if we legalised everything? Not some things, everything. Heroin, cocaine, ecstasy, mushrooms, all of it. Handed out at clinics. No arrest, no jail, no judgment. Just, here you go, have a nice day, please don't drive. Now before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure whatsoever. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It is always, without fail, somewhere around 2 a.m. The algorithm told me. But first I need you to sit with some questions, because this story raises a lot of them. Did legalizing every drug cause total chaos? Did people just start doing heroin in parks? Did crime go up? Did it go down? Did the government accidentally solve a problem that the rest of the world has been failing at for 100 years? Did anyone even ask the drug dealers how they felt about it? Were they upset? Did they have to pivot to something else, like artisanal cheese or real estate? Is this the most boring utopia ever imagined? Or is it secretly a disaster held together with good PR and very clean syringes? And perhaps most importantly, could you, a functioning adult who can barely commit to a gym membership, have survived this social experiment without making at least one questionable Tuesday decision? Congratulations! You've just woken up in Portugal in the year 2001. The government has just done something that made the rest of the world drop its collective coffee. You have no idea if this is brilliant or catastrophic. Neither does anyone else. Let's find out together. Let's talk about where Portugal was before the big decision, because the context matters, and also because it is genuinely grim. By the late 1990s, Portugal had a drug problem so severe it was making international headlines for all the wrong reasons. About 1% of the entire population, the whole country, was addicted to heroin. Not experimenting, not dabbling at parties. Addicted. And heroin addiction in the 90s wasn't the kind of thing you quietly managed between brunch and a book club. It was visible, devastating, and spreading through communities the way that kind of crisis always does. Fast, quiet at first, and then suddenly everywhere. HIV infections tied to intravenous drug use had made Portugal one of the worst affected countries in all of Western Europe. The prisons were overwhelmed, the police were overwhelmed, families were overwhelmed, and the traditional approach, arrest, punish, repeat, was producing exactly one consistent result. More of the same. Portugal wasn't a country that had arrived at this crisis through laziness or indifference. It had tried. It had passed tough drug laws. It had funded police operations. It had run public awareness campaigns with the kind of stark imagery that governments deploy when they want to look like they're doing something without necessarily knowing what that something should be. None of it worked. The heroin, which had flooded into Europe in the 1980s partly through Portugal's position as a gateway from former African colonies, had embedded itself into the social fabric in ways that law enforcement simply could not extract. To understand the scale, consider this. At the peak of the crisis, roughly half of all new HIV cases in Portugal were linked to intravenous drug use. Half. In a country that had only recently emerged from decades of authoritarian rule and was still building its modern healthcare and social services infrastructure, this was not a manageable statistic. It was a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion on every street corner and in every hospital ward. Drug-related crime had climbed steadily. Petty theft, burglary, street-level dealing, the whole ecosystem of desperation that surrounds addiction when addiction is criminalised and untreated, had made parts of Lisbon and Porto genuinely dangerous in ways that affected daily life for people who had never touched a drug in their lives. The prisons, meanwhile, were running at over double their intended capacity, with roughly half of all inmates serving sentences for drug-related offences, not trafficking kingpins, not cartel operatives, mostly users and small-time dealers caught in a system that could process them but not help them. The cruelest part of the whole arrangement was its futility. Officers arrested someone for possession, that person was processed and sentenced, served time or paid a fine, and returned to the exact same circumstances, same neighbourhood, same social network, same desperation, same lack of any meaningful alternative that had contributed to their drug use in the first place. The cycle was not just ineffective, it was, in a quiet and grinding way, a machine for producing more of what it claimed to be reducing. It is worth pausing here to appreciate that the people running this machine, the politicians, the police, the prosecutors, were not, for the most part, malicious. They were following a logic that most of the Western world had accepted as common sense, that criminalisation creates deterrence, that punishment changes behaviour, that the correct response to a moral and social problem is a legal one. That logic, applied with consistency and resources across multiple decades, had produced a country where 1 in 100 people was addicted to heroin, and the hospitals were full and the prisons were fuller. Portugal wasn't a failure, it was a warning. And in the late 1990s, just barely enough people in just barely the right positions were paying attention to what it was warning about. In 1998, the Portuguese government did something that doesn't happen often in politics. It admitted it didn't know what to do, and then asked people who might. A national commission was assembled, not just politicians, not just police, but doctors, sociologists, public health experts, and people who actually worked with those struggling with addiction. The brief was staggeringly open. Figure out what to do about this crisis, and don't let ideology get in the way of evidence. For a year, the Commission researched, debated, travelled to other countries, and read everything available on addiction science. What they came back with was a report that, if you'd handed it to most world governments, would have been quietly shelved next to the other reports that were too uncomfortable to act on. The commission was chaired by João Goulot, a family doctor from the Algarve who had spent years watching addiction hollow out patients and families and communities. Goulot was not a radical. He was not an ideologue. He was a doctor who had looked at the evidence for long enough to reach conclusions that the evidence rather forcefully supports. That addiction is a chronic health condition, that criminal penalties do not treat it, and that the countries doing the best job of reducing harm were the ones treating it like the health issue it is. He would go on to become one of the most influential figures in global drug policy, not because he had a brilliant political instinct, but because he was willing to follow his clinical training to its logical conclusions, even when those conclusions were politically inconvenient. The Commission travelled to other European countries, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, examining what was working and what wasn't. They looked at harm reduction models, treatment programs, substitution therapies. They interviewed researchers, healthcare workers, recovered addicts, families. They were, in other words, doing the thing that governments almost never do, which is genuinely trying to understand a problem before proposing a solution. What emerged from that year of work was a report that recommended decriminalising personal possession and use of all drugs, shifting resources from enforcement to treatment, expanding harm reduction services dramatically, and building a new infrastructure for social reintegration. The report was clear-eyed about what decriminalisation was and wasn't. It was not an endorsement of drug use, not a claim that drugs were harmless, and not a dismantling of the laws against trafficking and supply. It was a precise, evidence-based argument that the criminalisation of the users was making the crisis worse, not better, and that the money and energy being spent on arresting and imprisoning them would produce better outcomes if redirected toward treating them. That the Portuguese government actually implemented these recommendations in full in 2001 with genuine political will and funding remains one of the more surprising events in modern European policy history. Political courage tends to express itself in smaller increments. What Portugal did was take a full step into genuinely unknown territory, guided by evidence rather than precedent, at a moment when the alternative was simply watching more people die. The Commission's core insight, the one that made everything else possible, was deceptively simple. You cannot solve a health crisis with a legal response. Once you accept that, everything else follows, slowly, expensively, imperfectly, with a great deal of ongoing argument, but it follows. Before we go any further, let's clear something up that tends to get spectacularly muddled in every dinner party conversation about Portugal. Decriminalization is not the same as legalization. You've probably already conflated them, and that's fine, because so does approximately everyone. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized the personal possession and use of all drugs, and the key word there is personal. Carrying a small amount for your own use, no longer a criminal offence. You wouldn't be arrested, you wouldn't get a record, you wouldn't go to prison next to people who committed actual violent crimes. But the drugs were still illegal to sell, manufacture, or traffic. The dealers, still very much criminals, the cartels, still very much operating outside the law. The threshold for personal use was defined in law as a 10-day supply of any given substance. For cannabis, that was 25 grams. For heroin, 1 gram. For cocaine, 2 grams. These were not generous quantities, they were the kind of amounts a user might carry without necessarily intending to sell. Above those thresholds, you were in criminal territory. Below them, you were in administrative territory, which is a very different place. Think of it this way. In most countries, if you're caught speeding significantly over the limit, you face criminal charges. If you're caught a few miles over, you get a fine, an administrative penalty. You're still being told that what you did was wrong. There are still consequences. But the state has decided that the criminal justice system is not the appropriate machinery for this particular infraction. Portugal applied that same logic to drug possession. The behaviour was still discouraged. The consequences were still real. But the machinery had changed, and that change mattered enormously. Because here is what the criminal machinery does to a person. Beyond the immediate legal consequences, it gives them a record. A drug conviction in most countries attaches itself to a person's identity in ways that outlast the sentence, affecting their ability to rent housing, get a job, access certain social services, travel internationally. For someone already struggling with addiction, someone already facing the social and economic instability that both causes and is caused by substance dependence, these collateral consequences are not minor inconveniences. They are structural obstacles to the very recovery the system claimed it wanted to encourage. Portugal removed those obstacles. What remained, instead of a criminal proceeding, was the administrative framework, the dissuasion commission, the referral to services, the community service option. There were still consequences. There was still a system responding to drug use. But the system was now designed, at least in theory, to ask what this person needs rather than what this person deserves to suffer. It sounds like a subtle distinction. In practice, it was the difference between a generation of people accumulating criminal records that followed them for decades and a generation of people being connected, however imperfectly, however inconsistently, to the healthcare and social support system. Over 20 plus years, that distinction compounds. The people who didn't get criminal records got jobs, got housing, got stability. Some got sober. All of them got the chance, which sounds modest until you realise how many people in other countries never received it. Imagine being caught with drugs in your pocket, and instead of being hauled into a courtroom, you're instead escorted into a small fluorescent lit room and seated across from a lawyer, a social worker, and a doctor who are very calmly waiting to understand your life. That was the Portuguese Dissuasion Commission experience. These panels had the power to do several things. They could dismiss you with a warning, assign community service, refer you to a treatment program, or suspend your driver's license. What they could not do was throw you in prison. The entire encounter was designed around a single, radical premise: that the most useful thing a government can do when someone is struggling with addiction is ask what's going on and actually mean it. There were 3 commissions for the dissuasion of drug addiction in the Lisbon district alone, with others spread across the country. Each panel operated with a staff of trained professionals, typically a legal expert, a psychologist or social worker, and a healthcare professional. Cases were referred to the commissions by police who encountered someone in possession of quantities below the legal threshold. The officer filled out a form, the person received a summons, and within 72 hours they were sitting across that table. The sessions were not long. Typically they lasted around 30 minutes. But 30 minutes with 3 professionals whose entire brief is to understand your circumstances and connect you with appropriate resources is, for many people, particularly people whose primary experience of official systems has been adversarial, something genuinely novel. A first-time user might receive nothing more than a verbal warning and a pamphlet. A person showing clear signs of addiction might be offered an immediate referral to a treatment program. Someone who'd been through the commission before and declined treatment might be assigned community service, or a small fine, not as punishment exactly, but as a signal that the system was still paying attention. The commissions were deliberately non-punitive in atmosphere. There were no robes, no gavels, no public gallery. People were addressed by their first names. The language used was the language of health, not of crime. You were not a defendant. You were, in the vocabulary of the system, a person who had been using substances and who might benefit from support. Whether or not you agreed with that framing, it was a different experience than being read your rights and fingerprinted. For the majority of people who appeared before the commissions, primarily recreational or occasional users, the process was genuinely minor. A brief encounter with 3 strangers, a warning, an exit. These people were unlikely to have gone to prison anyway under the old system, and the main practical benefit for them was the absence of a criminal record, and the faint possibility that if they were heading toward a problem, someone had at least introduced themselves as available to help. For those with serious addiction, the commissions functioned as a gateway to treatment, not a perfect gateway, not a magical one, but a consistent and accessible point of contact between a struggling person and the services that might eventually make a difference. You could decline the referral, you were not compelled to enter treatment, but the door had been opened, the information had been given, and the message that treatment existed and was available and was not going to cost you your freedom to access had been delivered. Sometimes that message took years to act on. Sometimes it never did. But it was there, reliably, in that fluorescent lit room, every time the system encountered someone who needed it. Here's the part where we briefly put on lab coats. Not literally, you're in bed, but metaphorically. For most of the 20th century, Western policy treated addiction as a character flaw dressed up as a legal problem. If people were addicted to drugs, the logic went, it was because they were weak, or criminal, or lacking in willpower, and the appropriate societal response was to punish them out of it. The problem with that theory, which should have been obvious much earlier, is that it simply doesn't work. decades of neuroscience have since demonstrated that addiction rewires the brain in measurable physical ways, altering the dopamine system, disrupting decision-making, embedding compulsive behavior at a neurological level that no amount of jail time can address. The dopamine system, for those who haven't recently read a neuroscience textbook or watched a very long documentary at 2 a.m, is the brain's reward circuitry. When something feels good, food, social connection, physical pleasure, dopamine is released and the brain takes note. Over time, it learns to seek out the things that produce that response. Drugs of abuse, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, flood this system with dopamine at levels the brain was not designed to handle. The immediate effect is intense pleasure. The longer-term effect is a brain that has recalibrated its baseline around that artificial flood, making natural rewards feel flat by comparison and creating increasingly urgent compulsion to repeat the experience. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological process that has been observed, documented and replicated in research across multiple decades. The brain of a person with a serious addiction looks and functions differently from the brain of a person without one. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control, long-term planning and cost-benefit analysis, shows reduced activity in people with addiction disorders, which is to say, the part of the brain most responsible for the decision to stop using drugs is the part that addiction most directly compromises. Telling a heroin addict to simply choose to stop is, in neurological terms, roughly equivalent to telling someone with a broken leg to simply choose to walk normally. The instruction is not wrong exactly. It just does not engage with the actual problem. What does engage with the actual problem, according to the same research base, is a combination of medical treatment, stable environment, psychological support, and time. Medications like methadone and buprenorphine reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms, allowing the brain to begin the slow process of resetting its baseline. Therapy addresses the psychological dimensions of addiction, the trauma, the anxiety, the depression that very often either preceded the drug use or developed alongside it. Stable housing and social connection remove the environmental stresses that trigger relapse. None of this is fast, none of it is guaranteed, but it is what the evidence supports, and it is what Portugal chose to fund. The moral framing of addiction, the weakness narrative, the criminal narrative, was not just scientifically wrong, it was actively harmful, because it directed resources toward punishment rather than treatment, and because it created the shame environment that made people less likely to seek the treatment that might have helped them. Portugal didn't solve the science problem, researchers had already done that. What Portugal did was decide to build policy on top of it, which is rarer than it sounds, and more consequential than almost anyone expected. So the law passed. 2001. The handcuffs came off the users, the clinics opened, the Dissuasion Commission started meeting, and the world held its breath waiting for Portugal to descend into narco-chaos. Surely, the thinking went, if you remove the legal consequences of drug use, everyone will immediately start using drugs. That's just common sense, right? Except, and this is the part that required an entire generation of policymakers to quietly revise their assumptions, drug use did not skyrocket. In fact, among the general adult population it stayed relatively flat, and in some categories declined. Drug-related HIV infections fell dramatically. Drug-related deaths fell. Drug-related incarcerations fell so sharply that prisons, previously bursting with low-level possession cases, had room to breathe. Let's talk numbers briefly, because this is where the story gets both satisfying and slightly humbling for everyone who predicted disaster. In 1999, 2 years before reform, Portugal had roughly 50 drug-related deaths per million citizens. By 2017, that number had fallen to around 4 deaths per million, one of the lowest rates in the European Union. The EU average at that time was around 22 per million. In other words, a country that had decriminalised all drug use was experiencing dramatically fewer drug-related deaths than its neighbours who had not. HIV infections among people who inject drugs dropped from over 50% of new cases in 2000 to around 7% by 2015. Drug-related incarceration fell from roughly 44% of the prison population to around 24%. The number of people in treatment increased significantly, not because more people were using drugs, but because more people felt able to seek help without the threat of criminal consequences. These are not ambiguous findings. They are consistent, documented, and have been replicated by multiple independent research organisations, including the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction and the Cato Institute, which is, it should be noted, a libertarian think tank not generally predisposed to celebrating government health programs. The drug use rates themselves are worth examining carefully because they are where the story is most nuanced. Among the general adult population, use rates remained comparable to or lower than most European neighbours. Cannabis use, which had been lower than the European average before reform, remained so. Heroin use declined significantly. Among adolescents, the picture was mixed. Some surveys showed modest increases in certain substances in certain periods, which gave ammunition to critics of the policy and is worth acknowledging honestly. What the data did not show, at any point, in any category, with any demographic, was the flood of new users that critics had predicted. The people who were going to use drugs were already using drugs. The people who weren't were not waiting for the government's permission. It turned out that the threat of arrest was not, in fact, the primary thing keeping most people from experimenting with heroin. Slightly obvious in retrospect. Genuinely surprising apparently to a significant portion of the world's policymakers. One of the fastest and most measurable victories of Portugal's drug reform wasn't even about the drugs themselves, it was about needles. Before 2001, sharing needles was epidemic. Because carrying drug paraphernalia could invite police attention, users often shared equipment, and HIV spread with terrifying efficiency through those shared syringes. Harm reduction, a public health strategy that focuses not on stopping drug use, but on making it less likely to kill you in the meantime, had been philosophically incompatible with a punitive legal framework. Why set up clean needle exchanges if you're simultaneously arresting the people who need them? Harm reduction as a concept had existed in public health for decades before Portugal's reform, and its evidence base was solid. Needle exchanges, when implemented, reduce HIV transmission among intravenous drug users without increasing overall drug use. Safe injection sites, where people can use drugs under medical supervision, reduce overdose deaths without creating new users. Outreach programs that bring healthcare to people who use drugs, rather than waiting for those people to navigate their way through stigma and bureaucracy to healthcare, reduce infections and disease burden. All of this was known. The obstacle was not scientific uncertainty. The obstacle was political. These interventions looked to a certain kind of policymaker like condoning drug use, and that was not a message any politician wanted attached to their name. Decriminalization removed that political obstacle. You cannot hand out clean needles with one hand while arresting people with the other, and expect the people who need the needles to trust you enough to come forward. With criminal penalties for possession removed, the relationship between harm reduction services and the people they served changed fundamentally. Outreach workers could approach users in public without those users fleeing. Mobile health clinics could park in areas of concentrated drug use without their presence signalling police attention. People could carry clean equipment without that equipment being evidence of a crime. The expansion of needle exchange programs that followed Portugal's reform was rapid and substantial. By the mid-2000s, Portugal had one of the highest rates of needle exchange coverage in Europe. Methadone was available through an expanding network of clinics. Low-threshold services, meaning services that required minimal bureaucratic engagement to access, proliferated in urban areas with high rates of addiction. The philosophy was simple. Every clean needle distributed was a potential HIV transmission prevented. Every person who made contact with a harm reduction service was a potential connection to treatment. Lower the barriers and people come forward. The HIV numbers told the story with unusual clarity. In 2000, over 52% of new AIDS cases in Portugal were attributed to intravenous drug use. By 2015, that figure had dropped to around 7%. It was one of the most dramatic declines in drug-related HIV transmission ever documented in Europe. And it happened not through some breakthrough in virology or some miracle cure, but through the simple and unglamorous business of making clean needles available and stopping the arrest of people who needed them. If you're trying to understand why Portugal's reform worked, and specifically why it worked as fast as it did in some measurable categories, the needle programs are a large part of the answer. They were not new technology. They were existing technology finally allowed to operate without the legal framework fighting against them. Nobody ever seems to ask the drug dealers, which is a journalistic oversight, frankly, because their perspective on Portugal's decriminalization is genuinely interesting. Decriminalization didn't touch the supply side of the equation. Trafficking and selling remained criminal offences, and enforcement against dealers continued. But the downstream effects were significant. When users stopped being arrested, they stopped needing to conduct their transactions in the most dangerous hidden corners of the city. Open drug markets that had become notorious fixtures of Lisbon's poorer neighbourhoods began, over time, to shrink, not because of crackdowns, but because the ecosystem that sustained them was shifting. Street-level drug dealing in an enforcement-heavy environment has a particular geography. It clusters in places where surveillance is difficult, where police presence is sporadic, where residents are unlikely or unable to make effective complaints, typically the poorest and most marginalised neighbourhoods. The open drug markets that had made Casal Ventoso and similar areas infamous were not there because the dealers liked the view. They were there because poverty, housing instability, and the criminalisation of users had pushed everything underground and into the margins. The users came because that's where the drugs were. The dealers stayed because the users kept coming. A whole miserable economy arranged itself around the basic fact that both sides of this transaction needed to stay hidden. Decriminalisation didn't immediately dissolve this geography, but it began to disrupt the conditions that sustained it. As more users entered treatment, the pool of active street market customers shrank. As harm reduction services expanded into these neighbourhoods, the presence of health workers and outreach staff altered the social environment. As people in treatment stabilised and moved on, to jobs, to housing, to ordinary life, the density of desperation that characterised the open drug markets began to thin. The dealers themselves occupied a complicated position in this picture. Many of the people selling drugs at street level in Portugal's worst affected neighbourhoods were themselves users, operating at the lowest tier of a supply chain that stretched back to criminal organisations they had no real relationship with. When those street-level dealers were caught, they went to prison. Decriminalisation did not help them, because they were not being prosecuted for personal use but for supply. Some of them cycled through the dissuasion commissions as users and encountered the same social workers and treatment referrals as anyone else. Whether that encounter changed anything depended entirely on the individual. What is clear is that the overall market for street heroin in Portugal contracted significantly over the 2 decades following reform. Some of this was the direct effect of treatment reducing demand. Some of it was generational. The heroin epidemic of the 90s was concentrated in a particular cohort, and that cohort aged. Some of it was the broader diversification of the drug market toward other substances. But the data on drug-related crime, robbery, theft, and other acquisitive crime tied to the economics of addiction showed consistent declines after reform, which suggests that the ecosystem sustaining both the addiction and the dealing was genuinely disrupted. The dealers didn't thank the government for this, but the neighbourhoods around the old open markets gradually, quietly, became easier to live in. Here is the unsexy part that doesn't make headlines, but was arguably the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Portugal didn't just decriminalise drugs, it invested seriously and consistently in what happens after the crisis. Social reintegration programs, real ones, funded ones, helped people recovering from addiction find housing, access job training, and re-enter the workforce. Because addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum, and recovery doesn't happen in one either. The research on relapse is unambiguous. People return to substance use at dramatically higher rates when they have nowhere stable to live, no income, no community, and no sense of future. The social reintegration component of Portugal's reform was built around a deceptively obvious insight that treatment for addiction is only the beginning of what a person needs, and that without addressing the social and economic circumstances that both contributed to the addiction and were made worse by it, treatment gains are fragile. Clean and sober in a shelter is better than the alternative, but it is not stable. Clean and sober with a job and a lease is a different kind of thing entirely. It is the kind of stability from which a life can actually be rebuilt, rather than merely survived. The programs that emerged were varied and locally administered, which meant they were uneven in quality and reach. Some were run by health authorities, some by NGOs, some by religious organisations that have been doing social work in these communities long before the government arrived with a policy framework. What they shared was a common orientation toward the practical. Help people get documents, because many long-term drug users had lost or never obtained the identification papers that are the basic bureaucratic precondition for accessing almost any formal service. Help people get housing, because instability is the enemy of recovery. Help people access job training, because employment is not just income, it is structure, identity, and social connection, all of which are protective against relapse. Some of the most effective interventions were the most mundane, supported employment programs that worked with employers willing to hire people in recovery, vocational training in practical trades that didn't require lengthy educational prerequisites, subsidized housing arrangements that provided stability without requiring the perfect employment and credit history that most people emerging from addiction simply don't have, life skills programs that address the basic practical deficits, budgeting, time management, navigating bureaucracy that accumulate during years of active addiction. None of this is glamorous. There is no dramatic turning point, no single moment of transformation. It is a caseworker helping someone draft a CV. It is a landlord being persuaded to give someone a second chance. It is a person showing up to a job for the third week in a row and realizing gradually that they are capable of showing up. It is relentlessly, stubbornly ordinary, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes it effective. The goal of reintegration is not to create an interesting story. It is to create an unremarkable life, and an unremarkable life for someone who has spent years in the chaos of active addiction is a profound achievement. When Portugal announced its decriminalization policy in 2001, the international reaction was charitably skeptical. The United States government was displeased. Various European partners raised eyebrows. The general tone from the traditional law enforcement community was something along the lines of, "We'll be watching, and we expect a disaster." For the first few years, the story was largely ignored, There was no disaster, which is, unfortunately, a much harder story to tell than a disaster. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, as the data accumulated and independent researchers began publishing their findings, the tone shifted. The shift was not fast, and it was not universal, and it was not accompanied by the kind of institutional humility that the situation perhaps warranted. Organisations and governments that had spent decades insisting that criminalisation was the only viable approach to drug policy did not generally issue formal apologies or publicly revise their stated positions. What happened instead was quieter and more gradual. A slow accumulation of citations in academic papers, a growing trickle of delegation visits to Lisbon, a softening in the absolutism of the anti-decriminalisation rhetoric. The disaster that had been confidently predicted, year after year, simply failed to materialise, and eventually that absence became impossible to argue away. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which had historically been a robust defender of the enforcement-first approach, produced assessments of Portugal's model that were, while carefully hedged and explicitly not an endorsement, notably free of the condemnation that had characterised earlier international commentary. The European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction published detailed analyses of Portugal's outcomes that were, by the dry standards of European regulatory bodies, almost enthusiastic. Researchers from the United States, Canada, Australia and across Europe began citing Portugal in papers arguing for domestic policy reform. Journalists arrived in Lisbon. Documentaries were made. The story of the country that had legalised. The documentary filmmakers almost always use that word incorrectly, but never mind. All drugs not collapsed became a reliable feature in the international press cycle. Every few years, a new wave of writers discovered the story and treated it with the breathless surprise of someone who had personally uncovered a secret rather than someone who was the 47th journalist to file the same piece. Portugal's officials, to their credit, received these waves of attention with patient repetition of the same core message. It was not magic, it was not simple, and it required sustained investment in social services alongside the legal change. That message, nuanced and unsatisfying as it was, got somewhat less attention than the headline. What the global reaction ultimately demonstrated was something about the gap between evidence and policy that Portugal itself had been navigating since 2001. The evidence accumulated. It was clear, consistent, and independently verified. It pointed in a direction that most of the world's governments had not gone, and were not eager to go. And so the admiration, when it came, remained largely rhetorical, something that politicians in other countries cited in speeches without necessarily changing anything they were actually doing. Portugal had shown that a different approach was possible. Getting the rest of the world to act on that possibility was and remains a longer project. Let's not wrap this in a bow too quickly, because that would be dishonest and also boring. Portugal's drug reform was not a magic wand. Drug use was not eliminated. Addiction did not vanish. The country still had and still has problems. With alcohol, with prescription drug misuse, with the social and economic inequalities that feed addiction in the first place. The reform worked, to the degree it worked, in conjunction with broader social investment. Countries that have borrowed elements of the Portuguese model without the accompanying health and social infrastructure have seen more mixed results. Decriminalization is not by itself a solution. It is the removal of an obstacle that was preventing solutions from working. That distinction matters enormously, and it tends to get lost in the enthusiasm of people discovering the Portuguese example for the first time. Alcohol, for instance, was never part of the decriminalisation conversation, and yet alcohol-related harm in Portugal, as in most of Europe, has remained a significant and persistent public health challenge. Alcohol kills more people in Portugal annually than all illegal drugs combined. By a considerable margin, it causes more domestic violence, more traffic deaths, more liver disease, and yet the policy framework around alcohol looks nothing like the framework Portugal built for drugs, because alcohol is legal, normalised, culturally embedded and taxed, and nobody is suggesting running its users through dissuasion commissions. The inconsistency is not unique to Portugal, it is a feature of most societies. But it is worth noting because it suggests that Portugal did not solve the broader problem of substance-related harm. It addressed one acute and specific crisis with one targeted and specific intervention. Prescription drug misuse emerged as a growing concern in Portugal in the years following reform, particularly around benzodiazepines, sedatives, and anti-anxiety medications that are legally prescribed but widely misused. Portugal, like many European countries, developed rates of benzodiazepine dependence that were high by international standards, partly as a consequence of doctors using these medications to treat the anxiety and depression that so often accompany addiction recovery. The legal framework that addressed heroin possession had nothing to say about a bottle of pills with a doctor's signature on the label, and the harm reduction infrastructure that had been built around injectable drugs was not automatically applicable to a different kind of misuse pattern. The austerity years of the early 2010s also took a significant toll. Portugal's economy collapsed during the European sovereign debt crisis, and the government implemented severe spending cuts across public services, including health and social services. Some of the treatment capacity that had been painstakingly built in the years following reform was reduced. Waiting times for treatment programs increased. Staff were cut from outreach and reintegration programs. The infrastructure that had made decriminalization effective was, for a period, functioning at reduced capacity, and the data from those years reflected the strain. Drug-related deaths, which had been declining, stopped declining during the worst of the austerity period. The lesson was not that decriminalization had failed. It was that decriminalization without investment is a house built on a foundation that somebody keeps undermining. What Portugal's honest story tells us is that effective drug policy is not a single decision. It is a continuous commitment to funding, to staffing, to maintaining the unglamorous infrastructure of treatment and reintegration through political cycles and economic pressures that will reliably push against it. The countries watching Portugal and concluding that decriminalization is the answer are missing half the question. The other half is, and then what? And then what requires money and political will and patience and the willingness to keep investing in people that some portion of the electorate would rather simply punish. While Portugal was quietly building its public health approach, the rest of the world was broadly doing the opposite and paying for it. The United States, throughout the same period, incarcerated millions of people for drug-related offences, disproportionately targeting communities of colour, spending extraordinary sums on enforcement and imprisonment, and producing outcomes in terms of addiction rates, overdose deaths, and social harm that were measurably worse. By 2016, drug overdose deaths in the United States had surpassed car accidents as a leading cause of death. The opioid epidemic consumed communities across the country with a particular ferocity that no level of enforcement slowed. The numbers from the United States are worth sitting with for a moment, not to be grim for its own sake, but because scale matters when you're comparing policy approaches. By the mid-2010s, the United States was spending roughly $50 billion annually on drug control, the vast majority of which went to law enforcement, interdiction, and incarceration rather than treatment. The country had more people in prison for drug offences than the entire incarcerated population of most Western European countries combined. And the outcomes from this investment were not good. Addiction rates remained high. Overdose deaths climbed every year. The communities most affected by enforcement predominantly Black and Latino communities, bore the compound burden of both the addiction crisis and the criminalization that was supposed to address it. The racial dimension of the enforcement approach is impossible to separate from an honest assessment of its results. Study after study demonstrated that Black Americans were arrested for drug offences at rates far higher than white Americans, despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups. The criminal records that resulted cascaded through these communities, affecting employment, housing, voting rights, family stability, in ways that compounded the original harm of addiction with the additional harm of systematic legal disadvantage. A policy approach that was already failing on its own terms was also doing it in a way that concentrated its failures on the most vulnerable populations. Portugal's model, operating in a much smaller and more racially homogeneous country, did not have to confront this dimension in the same way. But the contrast is instructive about what criminalization actually does when you follow its logic to its full expression. Russia offered a different kind of comparison, and a grimmer one. The Russian government banned methadone maintenance treatment, which is one of the most evidence-backed interventions for opioid addiction, on the grounds that substituting one drug for another was not genuine treatment. The result was that people with opioid addiction in Russia had access to essentially no evidence-based treatment, continued to inject drugs, continued to share equipment, and continued to contract HIV at catastrophic rates. By the mid-2010s, Russia had one of the fastest-growing HIV epidemics in the world, driven almost entirely by intravenous drug use. The policy that had banned the treatment for ideological reasons was, in a very direct and measurable way, killing people. Not metaphorically, not as a matter of political interpretation, as a matter of epidemiology. The Philippines, under Rodrigo Duterte from 2016 onward, pursued the logical extreme of the enforcement approach, extrajudicial killings of suspected drug users and dealers, with estimates of the death toll ranging from several thousand to tens of thousands, depending on the source. The drug problem in the Philippines did not end. The killing did not produce the deterrence its architects claimed. What it produced was a climate of terror, a collapse of rule of law in poor communities, and an international human rights crisis. It was the enforcement model stripped of its pretensions about justice and revealed as what it had always contained: the willingness to treat drug users as problems to be eliminated rather than people to be helped. Portugal, with its fluorescent-lit dissuasion commissions and its mobile needle exchanges and its unremarkable reintegration caseworkers, was the furthest possible point from that world. Here's a perspective that doesn't often make it into the ideological debates about drug policy: the police. In Portugal, law enforcement had been just as overwhelmed as everyone else before reform. Officers were devoting enormous resources to pursuing low-level possession cases, arresting people who would be processed through an overcrowded system and emerge unchanged, often in worse shape. Many Portuguese police officers, when interviewed in the years following decriminalization, expressed something that surprised commentators: relief. Not universal, not unanimous, but widespread. The job of pursuing dealers and traffickers, the actual supply-side criminals, became cleaner without the noise of constant user arrest clogging the system. Think about what a police officer's working day looks like in a system where personal drug possession is a criminal offence. A significant portion of arrests are low-level possession cases, not major dealers, not organised crime, not the violent offenders that most people picture when they think about what police are for. Just users, often visibly struggling, caught with quantities that indicate personal use rather than supply. These arrests take time. They require paperwork. They require processing through a system, booking, charging, court appearances that was already overloaded. The officers involved knew, in many cases, that the person they were arresting would be out within weeks, and back in the same place doing the same thing, because nothing about the legal process had addressed the underlying problem. It was, for many officers, the definition of futile. João Figueira, a senior figure in the Portuguese judiciary police, who was involved in narcotics enforcement during and after the reform period, has spoken publicly about the ways decriminalization changed the operational reality for law enforcement. With user arrests removed from the equation, police resources could be directed more consistently towards supply, toward the dealers, the traffickers, the criminal organizations that were importing and distributing drugs on a commercial scale. The signal-to-noise ratio improved. Officers who had been spending a third of their time on possession cases could redirect that time and attention toward investigations that had a greater chance of actually disrupting the drug supply chain. There was also a subtler shift in the relationship between police and communities with high rates of drug use. In a criminalized system, users avoid police, not just to avoid arrest, but because any contact with law enforcement in the context of drug use can have consequences. That avoidance means that officers lose access to information that could be useful in pursuing supply-side enforcement. Users who might otherwise tell a police officer about a dealer or about a new and dangerous substance circulating in the area stay silent because the cost of any interaction is too high. Decriminalization changed that calculation. Not overnight, not completely, but enough that some outreach workers reported improved information flow between street-level communities and police in the years following reform. There were, of course, police officers who opposed the reform and continue to oppose it. Law enforcement culture is conservative by nature. It tends to favour frameworks it knows over frameworks it doesn't, and the idea that you could address drug use by not arresting people for drug use ran counter to instincts that had been trained and reinforced over decades. Some officers felt that decriminalization sent the wrong message. Some felt it undermined their authority. Some simply disagreed with the premise. That opposition was real and persistent, and it would be dishonest to suggest that Portuguese law enforcement embraced the reform unanimously. But the operational evidence that the system functioned better, that resources were more effectively deployed, that the relationship between police and communities improved in measurable ways, accumulated alongside the health data, and told a consistent story. One of the quieter, more devastating chapters of Portugal's pre-reform drug crisis was what happened to the children. When heroin addiction consumed a significant portion of the population through the 90s, the collateral damage included enormous numbers of children growing up in households where one or both parents were actively addicted and unable to provide stable care. Infant drug exposure, children in chaotic or absent home environments, intergenerational trauma of a kind that compresses poverty and instability into the next generation before it even starts. The research on adverse childhood experiences, the body of evidence examining the long-term consequences of childhood trauma, instability and neglect, is some of the most sobering in the social sciences. Children who grow up in households affected by addiction face significantly elevated risks across almost every measure of well-being: educational attainment, mental health, physical health, economic stability, and yes, substance use disorders of their own. The mechanism is partly psychological. Chronic stress in childhood disrupts the developing brain in ways that increase vulnerability to mental illness and addiction, and partly social, in that the circumstances of an unstable childhood tend to accumulate in ways that are hard to escape. Portugal in the 90s had a generation of children living through exactly this. Social services were aware of it, and, to the extent the system allowed, trying to respond. But the system was built around a criminal framework that saw the parents as offenders first and struggling people second, and that framework shaped everything, including the response to the children. Removing children from households was an option, and it happened. But removal creates its own traumas and its own cascade of consequences. The more useful intervention, stabilising the parent, treating the addiction, building household capacity to care for the children, required exactly the infrastructure that the criminal approach was failing to build. Post-reform, as treatment became more accessible, and as the social reintegration programs expanded, some of this began to shift at the family level. Parents and treatment were more likely to be able to maintain custody. Stable housing, accessed through reintegration programs, created more stable home environments. Social workers with a health-oriented brief could engage with families differently than officers with an enforcement-oriented one. None of this was fast enough for the children who were already growing up in the crisis. Those children were teenagers or adults by the time the reform effects began to compound. Their experience was shaped by the world that existed before 2001, and many of them carried that with them. But the children born into families engaged with the post-reform system had a measurably different set of circumstances. Parents who were stable in treatment were present in ways that parents in the grip of untreated addiction cannot be. The removal rates from households with a parent in treatment dropped compared to households where addiction was active and untreated. Schools in areas that had previously been overwhelmed with the spillover effects of the open drug market. The street-level chaos, the crime, the visible misery, reported gradual improvements in attendance and stability as the surrounding environment changed. These are not dramatic statistics. They do not produce the kind of headline numbers that make a compelling case in a policy debate. They are the slow, quiet, multi-generational dividend of having addressed a crisis properly rather than symbolically. A dividend that shows up, if at all, in the unremarkable lives of children who grew up in households that were stable enough because their parents got help to give them a chance at ordinary. Let's slow down for a moment and imagine the actual physical reality of what Portugal built. Somewhere in Lisbon, in a modest administrative building, on what might have been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, a young man is sitting across a table from 3 people he has never met. He was caught with a small amount of hashish. 6 months ago, in the old system, in another country, in the version of this story most of the world still lives. He might be looking at a criminal record, a fine, possible detention, and the kind of legal stain that follows a person into job applications and housing forms for years. Instead, he's sitting in a room that smells faintly of industrial cleaning fluid and old coffee, being asked by a social worker in a gentle, practiced tone that isn't quite kindness, but is something close to it, whether he has stable housing, whether he has been using regularly, whether there is something difficult going on in his life. The young man, let's say he is 22, let's say his name is Miguel, is nervous. He expected police. He expected consequences in the shape he recognised, which is the shape of uniformed authority and formal accusation. What he got instead was a summons on a piece of paper and an appointment time, and he almost didn't come, because the instinct when you have done something the state disapproves of is to stay as invisible as possible. But he came, and now he is here, and the social worker is asking him questions that nobody official has ever asked him before, in a tone that suggests the answers matter not as evidence but as information. Not what did you do, but how are you doing? Miguel, in this version of the story, is a recreational user, hashish on weekends, occasionally something stronger. He's not by any clinical measure addicted. He has a job, a flat, a functional life. For him, the commission session will be brief, a warning, a pamphlet about drug services, a note in a file he will likely never encounter again. He will leave slightly embarrassed, somewhat relieved, and marginally more aware that if his relationship with substances ever became a problem, there is a place he could go without it costing him everything. Now consider a different person in the same room. Call her Anna. She's 34. She's been using heroin for 8 years. She's been through this room before, twice in fact, and both previous times she declined the treatment referral. She is here now because she was found with a small quantity near a park, and the officer who found her filled out a form and sent her here rather than to a cell. She is tired in the way that 8 years of addiction makes a person tired, which is not sleepy but ground down, a tiredness that has settled into the bones and the eyes. The lawyer, the social worker and the doctor across the table have her file. They have seen people like Anna before, many of them, and they do not treat her previous refusals as evidence of bad faith or as a reason to withdraw the offer. The system has built patience into its architecture. There is no 3 strikes logic, no moment at which a person is deemed to have forfeited their access to help. The referral is offered again. The treatment program has space. The social worker writes down a name and a number and slides it across the table. Anna takes the piece of paper. She folds it in half. She puts it in her coat pocket. She leaves. 6 months later, she calls the number. It is not a story with a neat ending, but it is a story with a next chapter, which is more than the old system was offering her. The political communication around Portugal's drug reform was, to put it diplomatically, a significant challenge. Telling your electorate that you're going to stop arresting people for drug possession is not a campaign slogan that polls well in most democracies. The government of the day navigated this by emphasising health framing relentlessly. This was a medical issue, a public health emergency, and the response was being led by doctors and social workers, not ideologues. There was also a frank public reckoning with what the previous approach had produced. Portuguese media and political discourse in the late 90s had made the heroin crisis impossible to ignore. People knew someone. They'd seen the scenes in Lisbon's Casal Ventoso neighbourhood. The argument was not drugs are fine. It was, what we've been doing is not working and people are dying and we're going to try something different. The socialist government under Antonio Guterres that oversaw the reform was not a particularly radical administration. It did not come to power on a platform of drug liberalisation. The decriminalization policy emerged from the Commission's recommendations and was implemented because the evidence was compelling and the existing approach was visibly catastrophic, not because there was a broad popular mandate for reform. This matters because it meant the communication had to work hard. You were not preaching to a converted audience. You were explaining a counterintuitive policy to a public that had been told for decades that tough drug laws were the appropriate response to drug problems. The framing that proved most durable was the medical one. The Commission's report had been explicit. Addiction is a disease. The government translated this into communication that emphasised compassion without being perceived as permissiveness. We're not saying drug use is acceptable, the message went. We're saying that criminal punishment has failed to reduce it, and that treatment works better. The doctor is the right person to lead this response, not the prosecutor. That message was not universally accepted. There were politicians, religious leaders, and community figures who argued strongly against the reform, and their opposition did not disappear after 2001. But the message was consistent enough, and the visible crisis compelling enough, that the reform passed and survived. Crucially, the government invested in public information campaigns that explained not just what had changed, but why. Materials were produced for schools, for healthcare settings, for community organisations. The dissuasion commissions themselves were part of the communication infrastructure. Their existence as a visible, accessible, non-threatening point of contact between the state and people who used drugs sent a message about the state's orientation that no poster campaign could fully replicate. When the government says you won't be arrested and then actually doesn't arrest you, the communication becomes credible in a way that rhetoric alone cannot achieve. The media played a complicated role. Some outlets covered the reform sceptically, emphasising the risks and giving significant voice to critics. Others became, over time, advocates, particularly as the data began to accumulate and the predicted disaster failed to materialise. The story of Portugal's drug reform is, in part, a story about what happens when evidence and journalism engage seriously with each other over an extended period, and the answer is, eventually, the evidence wins. Not instantly, not without a fight, not without a great deal of misrepresentation along the way, but eventually. What Portugal demonstrated was that a democratic government could make a genuinely counterintuitive policy decision, communicate it honestly and survive the political consequences, because the consequences of the previous policy were visible enough, and the outcomes of the new one compelling enough to sustain support through the inevitable periods of doubt and criticism. That is not a small lesson. It is, in fact, one of the most important things the Portuguese experiment has to teach. Something mildly absurd began happening in the years after Portugal's reform started showing results. It became, quietly, a pilgrimage destination for policy researchers. Government officials from countries across Europe, North America, Latin America, and beyond began booking flights to Lisbon, not to see the monuments or eat the pastel de nata, well, also to eat the pastel de nata, but to visit the dissuasion commissions, tour the treatment centres, and sit in conference rooms with Portuguese health officials asking essentially, how do you do this and can we copy it? João Goulart, who'd become the face of Portugal's drug policy internationally by the time the delegation started arriving in earnest, has described a schedule in the years after the reform began drawing attention that was essentially a continuous series of meetings with foreign visitors, Canadian health officials, American researchers from harm reduction organisations, British MPS doing fact-finding trips that they hoped nobody back home would notice, Latin American government ministers whose countries were experiencing the violent downstream consequences of American-driven enforcement policy and were desperately seeking alternatives, European counterparts from countries where the political conditions for reform didn't yet exist, but where individuals within the system were looking for ammunition. The visits followed a predictable pattern: arrival, tour of a dissuasion commission, visit to a treatment centre, meeting with health officials, extended conversation with Goulart, who delivered essentially the same message to each delegation, with the patient consistency of a man who has said something so many times it has become a kind of mantra. This was not magic. This required investment. This cannot be separated from the social services component. The legal change alone is not sufficient. Some of the visitors heard this message and took it seriously. Others heard it and went home to write reports that emphasized the headline, "Decriminalization works," without the footnotes about what makes it work, which are expensive and politically difficult and therefore inconvenient to include. The phenomenon created a minor Portuguese export industry in drug policy expertise. Researchers affiliated with Portuguese institutions began publishing influential papers. Organisations like the Transform Drug Policy Foundation in the United Kingdom and the Drug Policy Alliance in the United States used Portugal as their primary reference case for reform advocacy. The country that had once been cited internationally as an example of the drug crisis became cited internationally as an example of the solution to the drug crisis, which was a reputational transformation of a kind that small countries rarely experience. Some of the visits resulted in genuine change. Canada's approach to harm reduction, which eventually included supervised consumption sites and expanded decriminalization conversations, was influenced by the Portuguese model. Several European countries adjusted their administrative approaches to possession in ways that drew on Portugal's framework without replicating it exactly. Oregon, in the United States, passed Measure 110 in 2020. decriminalising personal possession of small quantities of all drugs, citing Portugal explicitly as evidence that the approach could work. The implementation in Oregon was, to be generous, rocky. The social services investment that Portugal had built over 2 decades was not replicated alongside the legal change, and the early outcomes were mixed, which gave ammunition to critics and demonstrated once again the point that Goulot had been making to every delegation for 20 years. The law is not enough. The law is just the beginning. Something subtle but important happened to the way Portuguese society talked about addiction in the years following reform. Language shifts slowly, and it shifts unevenly, and it never shifts completely. There were still people in Portugal who used the old vocabulary, the moral vocabulary, the weakness and failure vocabulary. But the structural message being sent by the state, that addiction was a health condition, that users were patients rather than criminals, that the appropriate response was treatment rather than punishment, began to work its way into public discourse. Stigma, while it didn't vanish, began to erode in measurable ways. Language matters in health contexts in ways that go beyond politeness. The words used to describe a condition shape the way people think about it, the way they behave toward those who have it, and the way those people think about themselves. Research on addiction stigma has consistently shown that the language of moral failure, addict, junkie, abuser correlates with worse treatment outcomes, lower rates of help seeking, and higher rates of discrimination in healthcare settings. Clinicians who use morally loaded language in patient interactions produce worse outcomes than those who use clinical language. Not because language is magic, but because language signals an attitude, and that attitude shapes the interaction, and that interaction either builds or destroys the therapeutic relationship that treatment depends on. Portugal's reform did not mandate a language change. It did not issue official guidance on approved terminology. What it did was change the institutional framing from criminal to medical, and that change cascaded gradually and unevenly into the vocabulary that officials, healthcare workers, journalists, and eventually ordinary people used when talking about drug use and addiction. Media coverage shifted over time from the crime report framing that dominated coverage in the 90s, user arrested, user sentenced, user found dead, toward a health report framing that situated addiction in the context of disease, treatment, and social circumstance. Healthcare workers began receiving addiction training as a routine part of medical and nursing education, rather than as a specialised subspecialty that most clinicians could reasonably ignore. General practitioners were trained to screen for substance use disorders the same way they screened for diabetes or hypertension, as a common, treatable, chronic condition that their patients might have and that the healthcare system had tools to address. The effect of this was that people with addiction disorders encountered a different kind of primary care interaction than they had before, one that was more likely to include a referral to treatment, a conversation about options, a follow-up appointment, rather than the slightly awkward mutual silence that had characterized medical encounters on the subject when both doctor and patient understood addiction to be primarily a criminal matter rather than a health one. None of this transformed Portuguese culture overnight, or completely. The old attitudes persisted, particularly in older generations and in communities with strong religious and conservative traditions. People in recovery still reported stigma in employment, in family relationships, in social contexts. The shame did not disappear, but it was no longer being actively reinforced by the official position of the state, and that absence of reinforcement, sustained over 2 decades, produced a measurable shift in the environment in which addiction was experienced and discussed. A shift not dramatic enough to make headlines, but consistent enough to make a difference. which is, it turns out, how most of the genuinely important social changes actually happen. One of the least cinematic but most effective tools in Portugal's harm reduction arsenal was the expansion of methadone and buprenorphine substitution treatment, medications that suppress opioid withdrawal and cravings, allowing people addicted to heroin to stabilize their lives without the chaos and risk of active street addiction. Before reform, access to these programs was limited and stigmatized. Post-reform, the government invested in expanding access dramatically. The results were consistent with decades of international evidence. Substitution treatment keeps people alive, reduces crime, reduces HIV transmission, improves functioning, and creates the kind of stability from which recovery and reintegration become possible. Methadone maintenance therapy works, in simplified terms, by occupying the same receptors in the brain that heroin occupies, without the intense high that makes heroin so compulsive, and without the dangerous variability in purity and dosage that makes street heroin so deadly. A person on a stable methadone dose wakes up in the morning, goes to a clinic or pharmacy, receives their daily dose, and goes about their day, without the withdrawal sickness that drives so much of the desperate behaviour associated with heroin addiction, without the financial pressure of funding a street habit, and without the exposure to the infectious disease risks of injecting unknown substances. It is, by almost every measure, better than the alternative. This has been established by research for decades. It was established before Portugal's reform. The obstacle was never the evidence. The obstacle was the attitude. Substitution treatment was, and in many places remains, politically and culturally controversial because it looks, to a certain kind of observer, like giving people drugs rather than helping them stop. The argument that methadone replaces one addiction with another is medically illiterate but politically durable. It conflates physical dependence, which is a physiological state that many medications produce, and which is managed rather than feared in every other medical context, with addiction, which is a behavioural and psychological disorder characterised by compulsive use despite harm. A person stable on methadone is not in the grip of addiction in any clinically meaningful sense. They are managing a chronic condition with a medication that works, the same way a diabetic manages their condition with insulin. Portugal expanded access to methadone through a network of clinics, pharmacies, and outreach programs that progressively lowered the threshold for entry. In the early years of the program, accessing methadone required navigating bureaucratic barriers that effectively excluded many of the people who most needed it, the most unstable, the most chaotic, the most disconnected from formal services. As the reform philosophy bedded in, those barriers were reduced. Low-threshold programs allowed people to access substitution treatment with minimal documentation requirements, shorter waiting periods, and less frequent clinic attendance for those who had demonstrated stability. The results accumulated in the way that slow and steady interventions accumulate, not dramatically, but reliably. People on methadone programs were less likely to inject drugs, less likely to contract HIV, less likely to commit acquisitive crime, more likely to maintain housing and employment. They were, in the dry language of outcome studies, functioning better across most measures of well-being. They were also alive, which is the precondition for everything else, and which was, in the years of the worst of the heroin epidemic, not something you could take for granted. The methadone programs were not glamorous. They did not produce transformative stories. They produced day after day, dose after dose, year after year, people who are still here. In the interest of fairness, because history deserves it, let's acknowledge that some of the critics of Portugal's reform raised concerns that were not entirely without merit. Libertarians who opposed the policy from the right argued that decriminalization without full legalization still left a criminal supply chain intact, and they were correct. The drugs were still coming from criminal organisations, still funding violence and trafficking. Those who worried that reduced stigma might lower the perceived risk of drug experimentation among young people had evidence to point to in some categories of youth drug use that did show modest increases in certain periods. Social conservatives who argued that the state was sending a mixed message by simultaneously discouraging drug use and not criminalising it were identifying a genuine tension in the policy's logic, even if they drew the wrong conclusions from it. The supply-side critique is the most substantive. By decriminalising possession while maintaining criminal penalties for supply, Portugal created a legal framework that addressed the individual user without touching the criminal infrastructure serving them. The heroin in Portugal's streets in 2005 came from the same Afghan poppy fields, through the same trafficking networks, via the same criminal organisations as it did in 2000. Decriminalisation did nothing to disrupt that supply chain, and arguably, if it reduced overall demand and therefore market size, had only marginal indirect effects on it. The people profiting from drug trafficking at the commercial level were entirely unaffected by the legal change. This is a genuine limitation, and it is the reason why advocates for full legalisation and regulation, a more radical step that Portugal has not taken, argue that decriminalisation is at best a half measure. The youth drug use concern deserves honest engagement. The data on adolescent drug use in Portugal following reform is mixed and contested. Some surveys conducted in the years after 2001 showed modest increases in cannabis use among teenagers compared to pre-reform baselines. Whether this represents a causal effect of decriminalisation, a broader European trend in youth cannabis use that was occurring regardless of policy, a measurement artifact or some combination of factors is genuinely uncertain. Critics who highlighted these figures were not simply cherry-picking, they were pointing to a real pattern in real data. The counter-argument that the increases were modest were not followed by increases in more harmful substances and occurred in the context of dramatically improved outcomes on every other measure is compelling, but does not entirely dismiss the concern. What the critics of Portugal's reform largely got wrong was the magnitude and the direction of the effects they predicted. The claim that decriminalisation would produce a dramatic increase in drug use across all demographics did not materialise. The claim that it would create a haven that attracted drug tourists from neighbouring countries, a concern raised with particular energy in the years before reform, was not borne out by data on population movement or drug use rates. The predicted collapse of social order did not occur. The disasters that critics forecast with confidence were not delivered. What the evidence produced instead was a set of genuinely mixed, complex, real-world outcomes that didn't fit neatly into either the triumphant reformers narrative or the alarmed critics narrative. Good outcomes on the measures that mattered most: deaths, infections, incarceration, treatment uptake. Mixed outcomes in some areas of youth use, persistent challenges in alcohol, prescription drugs, and the social conditions underlying addiction, an infrastructure that worked well when funded adequately and strained when it wasn't. The messy, unresolved, ongoing reality of a policy experiment conducted in the real world rather than a laboratory, which is, it turns out, exactly what honest policymaking looks like. 21. What recovery actually looks like. Let's imagine a person. Call him Antonio, it's a common name. In 1998, Antonio is 24 in Lisbon and has been using heroin for 2 years. Under the old system, Antonio would likely have been arrested at some point, processed through a system with no meaningful treatment component, and released back into the exact same circumstances that contributed to his addiction. In 2002, Antonio is 28, still using, but now he has been before a dissuasion commission. He was referred to a treatment program. He didn't engage at first. He missed appointments, relapsed, came back. That is what addiction recovery looks like. It is not linear. It does not happen on the first try. Antonio's story, fictitious in its details but drawn from the aggregate reality of thousands of documented cases, is worth following through its actual shape rather than its Hollywood version. The Hollywood version has a turning point, a moment of clarity, a rock bottom, a single decision that changes everything. The clinical reality is a process that looks, from the outside, like failure punctuated by brief improvement, and looks from the inside like exhaustion punctuated by occasional moments of believing it might be possible to live differently. Relapse is not the exception in addiction recovery. It is the norm. The average person with a serious opioid addiction requires multiple treatment episodes before achieving sustained recovery. A system that gives up after the first relapse, or that treats relapse as evidence that treatment doesn't work, rather than evidence that chronic diseases require ongoing management, will fail most of the people it claims to be serving. Portugal's system was built with this reality in mind, imperfectly and unevenly but structurally. The dissuasion commissions had no three strikes logic. The treatment programs had no rule that a missed appointment forfeited your place. The harm reduction services were available regardless of how many times you had previously declined them. This sounds obvious until you consider how many systems, medical, legal, social, operate on an implicit or explicit assumption that people in crisis have a limited number of chances before the system's patience runs out. Portugal's reform, at its best, extended the time frame of patience to something closer to the actual time frame of recovery, which is often years, sometimes a decade, occasionally a lifetime of management. By 2006, Antonio is 32. He is on a methadone program he has been maintaining consistently for 14 months, the longest stretch of stability he has had since his early 20s. He has housing, a small flat in a part of the city he has lived his whole life, through a social reintegration program that his caseworker helped him navigate. He's working part-time at a warehouse, not glamorous work, but regular, structured, income-generating work that gives his days a shape they haven't had in years. He has not been in a hospital for a drug-related reason in over a year. His HIV test came back negative. None of this is a triumph in the narrative sense. Antonio has not written a memoir or given a speech. He has not been photographed for a government campaign. He is simply a person living an ordinary life in a city that treated him, when he needed it, as someone worth the effort of helping. That ordinariness is the point. Recovery, when it works, produces people who disappear into the general population, who become unremarkable, which is the best possible outcome for someone whose years of active addiction were defined by chaos. The goal was never a story. The goal was a life. And Portugal gave Antonio, and people like him in the thousands, enough of a framework to build one. 22. The money question. Was it actually cheaper? One of the more persuasive arguments for the Portuguese model, especially to audiences primarily motivated by fiscal considerations, is the economic one. Imprisoning people is extraordinarily expensive. In the United States, incarcerating one person for 1 year cost more than sending them to many universities. The criminal justice infrastructure required to process, prosecute and imprison hundreds of thousands of low-level drug offenders annually consumes an enormous amount of public money, money that produces, as Portugal had discovered, very poor outcomes. Treatment is also expensive, but it is considerably less expensive than imprisonment, and it produces better outcomes, which means lower long-term costs in healthcare, social services, lost productivity, and criminal justice involvement. Let's be specific, because specificity is where economic arguments earn their keep. A bed in a Portuguese prison in the early 2000s cost roughly €35 per prisoner per day, a figure that included housing, feeding, staffing, administration, and all the attendant costs of maintaining a carceral institution. A place in a drug treatment program cost less, typically in the range of €15 to €25 per day for residential treatment, and considerably less for outpatient programs. The math is not complicated. If you shift a person from a prison cell to a treatment program, you are spending less money. If that treatment program reduces recidivism, reduces future healthcare costs, reduces future criminal justice involvement, and returns a person to productive employment and tax-paying status, the long-term economic case becomes even clearer. Portugal's prison population dropped significantly in the decade following reform. Drug-related offenders, who had constituted roughly 44% of the incarcerated population, declined to around 24% by the mid-2000s. The beds freed up by this reduction had economic value, either as genuine cost savings or as capacity for the incarceration of people whose offences actually warranted it. The justice system, less clogged with possession cases, could process other cases more efficiently. Courts had more time, prosecutors had more bandwidth. The economic benefits of decriminalization cascaded through the justice system in ways that were harder to measure precisely but were consistently positive in direction. The treatment investment did require upfront spending. Building the infrastructure, the clinics, the outreach programs, the reintegration services, the staffing. Cost money that had to be found in a budget that was simultaneously being asked to fund a functioning criminal justice system. Portugal was not a rich country in 2001. It was a mid-sized European economy with genuine fiscal constraints and a healthcare system that was still maturing. The decision to invest in treatment over incarceration was not cost-free. It required political choices about where to direct limited public resources, and those choices had opportunity costs. But the trajectory over time was consistently favourable. Studies examining the economic impact of Portugal's reform, including analyses by the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction and by independent academic researchers, found net positive economic effects when the full picture was considered. Reduced incarceration costs, reduced healthcare costs from HIV and other drug-related infections, reduced criminal justice costs from acquisitive crime tied to addiction, and increased economic productivity from people who were in treatment or recovery, rather than in active addiction or prison. The numbers were not dramatic enough to suggest that Portugal had accidentally discovered a fiscal windfall. They were consistent enough to suggest that the economic case for the health-based approach was as solid as the humanitarian one, which raises the uncomfortable question of why, given that the evidence on both grounds pointed in the same direction, the rest of the world took so long to pay attention. 23. The global opioid crisis and what Portugal's model means now. While Portugal was demonstrating that a health-based approach could reduce the harms of addiction, the rest of the world was sleepwalking into a catastrophe it had been warned about. The opioid epidemic, fueled in the United States and elsewhere by a combination of pharmaceutical industry malfeasance, regulatory failure, and the same underlying social conditions that Portugal had worked to address, killed hundreds of thousands of people in the 2000s and 2010s. Overdose deaths from synthetic opioids like fentanyl eventually reached a scale that defied easy comprehension. In this context, Portugal's example became not just interesting but urgent. The American opioid crisis had a specific origin story that distinguished it from Portugal's heroin epidemic in important ways. Where Portugal's crisis was driven primarily by the availability of cheap heroin from former African colonies and the social disruption of a country in rapid political transition, America's opioid epidemic was partly manufactured, deliberately for profit, by pharmaceutical companies that aggressively marketed OxyContin and similar opioid painkillers with false assurances about their addiction potential, saturating communities with prescription drugs that created physical dependence before patients understood what was happening to them. When those prescriptions dried up, many people transitioned to heroin and later to illicitly manufactured fentanyl, which is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine and kills with terrifying efficiency when dosage is miscalculated by even a small margin. By 2022, overdose deaths in the United States were running at over 100,000 per year. 100,000 in a single year. The enforcement response, more arrests, more prosecution of dealers, heavier sentencing for drug trafficking had not bent the curve. The supply of fentanyl, manufactured primarily in Mexico using precursor chemicals from China, was too cheap, too potent, and too deeply embedded in the street drug supply for enforcement alone to address. People who had become dependent on opioids continued seeking them, and continued dying when the doses they encountered were stronger than expected, which in the fentanyl era was most of the time. Into this context, the Portuguese model arrived as evidence that something different was possible. Harm reduction advocates in the United States had been citing Portugal for years, but the opioid crisis gave the argument a new urgency and a new audience. Emergency rooms full of overdose patients, counties where life expectancy was declining, families devastated by losses that everyone could see were preventable. These realities created political pressure for different approaches that the pre-epidemic status quo had not generated. Supervised consumption sites, which had been operating in Canada, Switzerland, and the Netherlands for years, began gaining political traction in American cities. Naloxone, the medication that reverses opioid overdose, was distributed more widely. Some cities and states began moving toward decriminalization, explicitly citing Portugal. The relevance of Portugal's model to the fentanyl crisis is real, but requires careful translation. The Portuguese crisis involved a drug, heroin, where the margin between a typical dose and a lethal one, while narrow, is wider than fentanyl's. The harm reduction toolkit developed for heroin is applicable to fentanyl but requires additional components, fentanyl test strips for instance, which allow users to check their drugs for contamination that didn't exist in the Portuguese reform era. The faster and more lethal the drug, the more urgent the harm reduction response needs to be. Portugal showed that harm reduction works. Applying that lesson to fentanyl requires taking it seriously enough to fund and implement the specific tools the current crisis demands. 24. What the rest of Europe learned. Eventually, Portugal wasn't entirely alone. Other European countries had been experimenting with elements of harm reduction for years. The Netherlands had its famously tolerant cannabis policy. Switzerland had pioneered heroin-assisted treatment in the 90s, and various Nordic countries had invested heavily in treatment infrastructure. But Portugal's comprehensive national decriminalization was something different in scale and scope, and it arrived with a clear before and after data set that other nations could examine. Over the following 2 decades, countries including Germany, the Czech Republic and others moved toward decriminalization or expanded harm reduction programs, citing the Portuguese evidence. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment program deserves a moment of attention because it represents the logical extension of the harm reduction philosophy beyond what even Portugal implemented. Beginning in the mid-90s, Switzerland began offering pharmaceutical-grade heroin to people with severe, treatment-resistant opioid addiction, providing the drug itself in a clinical setting under medical supervision to people for whom methadone and other treatments had not produced stable outcomes. The program was controversial, vigorously opposed, and carefully evaluated. The results were consistent. Participants showed significant improvements in health, reductions in criminal activity, reductions in street drug use, and improvements in social functioning. Switzerland ran the program for years, expanded it, and continues it to this day. It is, by almost every measure, successful. It is also politically impossible in most countries, which tells you something about the gap between what the evidence supports and what democracies are prepared to implement. Germany's movement toward cannabis legalization, which culminated in legislation passed in 2023 allowing adults to possess and cultivate cannabis for personal use, represented the most significant European drug policy shift since Portugal's decriminalization, and it drew explicitly on 2 decades of accumulated evidence from Portugal and elsewhere. The German debate was long, contentious, and politically costly for the coalition government that pursued it. Opposition from law enforcement, from medical associations worried about youth access, and from neighbouring countries concerned about cross-border effects was substantial. The government's response, drawing on the Portuguese playbook, emphasised public health framing, investment in prevention and treatment alongside the legal change and careful monitoring of outcomes. The Dutch, who had operated their famous coffee shop system for decades, without ever formally legalising cannabis at the production level, watched Germany's move with a mixture of interest and relief that someone else had finally done the thing they'd been awkwardly avoiding doing for 30 years. The Czech Republic had maintained a relatively liberal approach to personal drug possession since the early post-communist period, and its experience, which showed outcomes broadly consistent with Portugal's, provided additional data points for the European evidence base. Belgium, Luxembourg and Malta all moved toward cannabis decriminalization or limited legalization in the early 2020s. The direction of travel across Western Europe was consistent, away from criminalization of users toward administrative or health-based responses, guided by evidence that the enforcement approach had failed. What was striking, surveying the European landscape 2 decades after Portugal's reform, was the distance between the evidence and the political speed of response. Every country that moved toward reform had access to the same data Portugal had generated. Most of them had access to it for 10 years before they acted on it, and some of them for 20. The delay was not about the evidence, it was about politics, about the risk calculations of individual politicians, about the lag between public opinion and elite opinion, about the institutional inertia of criminal justice systems that had been organised around a particular framework for decades and did not dismantle themselves willingly. Portugal moved faster than almost everyone because its crisis was more acute than almost everyone's. The rest of Europe moved slower because it could afford to. Whether that was a luxury or a failure depends on how you count the people who died in the interval. 25. The quiet lesson. In all of this. At its heart, Portugal's drug experiment is not really a story about drugs. It is a story about what happens when a society decides to treat its most vulnerable members as human beings, worth investing in rather than problems to be contained. It is a story about what evidence-based policy looks like when it's actually followed, rather than buried under political convenience. And it is, perhaps most quietly, a story about the difference between asking, how do we stop this from happening, and asking, what do people actually need? The Portuguese model did not emerge from idealism. It emerged from desperation and a willingness to be honest about failure. The willingness to be honest about failure is rarer than it sounds. Most political systems are structurally incentivized against it. Admitting that a policy has failed requires admitting that the people who implemented and defended that policy were wrong, which requires a kind of institutional humility that runs counter to the self-preservation instincts of governments, bureaucracies, and political parties. Portugal in the late 90s was a country where the failure was so visible and so devastating that denial had become impossible, not because the political culture was uniquely honest, but because the heroin crisis was too large and too public to be managed by rhetoric. When 1% of your population is addicted to a drug and your HIV rates are among the worst in Europe, you have run out of room to claim the current approach is working. That specific kind of productive desperation, where the failure is undeniable enough to force genuine reconsideration, is an uncomfortable model for other countries to rely on. You don't want to wait until the crisis is catastrophic enough to be undeniable. You want to act on the evidence before you get there. But Portugal's experience suggests that for democratic governments, the pathway to evidence-based reform often runs through visible failure, because visible failure creates the political space that counterintuitive reform requires. It is a depressing observation about how policy change actually works, but it is an honest one. What the Portuguese experiment offers beyond the specific policy recommendations is a kind of template for how a society can change its mind about something important. It requires leadership willing to commission genuine expertise rather than political cover. It requires experts willing to follow the evidence to uncomfortable conclusions. It requires a communication strategy that leads with the failure of the status quo rather than the virtue of the proposed alternative. And it requires sustained investment, not a single legislative moment, but an ongoing commitment to funding the infrastructure that makes the policy work in practice, rather than just in principle. The lesson is not that decriminalization is the answer to every drug problem everywhere. The lesson is that treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal one is supported by evidence, is more humane, is more economically efficient, and produces better outcomes than the alternative, and that these facts were available long before most countries acted on them. Portugal acted on them in 2001, in a fluorescent-lit room where a social worker asked a young man how he was really doing, and meant it. Everything else followed from that. Portugal's answer to the drug question was not a solution. It was a reframe. It asked, what if the point isn't punishment? What if the point is people? And for one small country at the edge of the Atlantic, the answer turned out to matter more than anyone expected. 26. The faces, behind the statistics, personal stories from the crisis. Before we stay too comfortable in the language of policy papers and percentage points, let's remember that every number in Portugal's drug story was once a person having the worst stretch of their life. The heroin epidemic of the 1980s and 90s didn't arrive with a news ticker and a graph. It arrived as a neighbour who started looking different, a sibling who stopped coming to dinner, a colleague whose absences became too frequent to explain away. Portugal in those years was a country in the particular pain of watching people it knew disappear by degrees, not all at once, but in the slow, grinding way that addiction works, which is visible to everyone and impossible to stop with the tools most families and communities had at hand. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to loving someone who is addicted, a grief without a clean object, because the person is still alive but increasingly absent, still present, but increasingly unreachable. Families in Portugal during the worst of the heroin years navigated this grief in the context of a society that framed addiction as a moral failure, which meant the grief had to be navigated in silence. You didn't tell your neighbours that your son was using heroin. You did not tell your employer. You did not, if you could avoid it, engage with the system that treated your family member as a criminal and therefore treated you, by extension, as the family of a criminal. The shame was not incidental to the crisis. It was structural to it. It kept people from seeking help. It kept families from talking. It kept the crisis invisible in ways that made it worse. Stories from social workers and healthcare providers who worked in Lisbon and Porto during the 90s describe a landscape that was simultaneously hyper-visible and deeply hidden. The open drug markets of Casal Ventoso were hyper-visible. Anyone could see them, and many journalists photographed them, and politicians pointed to them as evidence of crisis. But the individual stories behind those scenes, the specific person, their specific history, the specific sequence of circumstances that had brought them to that specific corner, were hidden because exposure carried consequences that the system made too costly. After 2001, something began to shift in this dynamic. Not instantly, not uniformly, but perceptibly. People began showing up to treatment services who had not come before, not because the crisis was suddenly worse, but because the barrier to showing up had been lowered. Healthcare workers reported that patients were more willing to disclose drug use in clinical settings because the disclosure no longer risked criminal consequences. Family members began engaging with support services more openly because the family member they were worried about was now a patient rather than a criminal in the eyes of the system they were asking for help. The stories that emerged from this more open environment were not for the most part dramatic. They were ordinary in the way that human suffering is ordinary, specific, particular, mundane in their details even when devastating in their consequences. A mother who had spent 3 years not knowing where her daughter was, and then found her through an outreach service, and then spent 2 more years watching her daughter cycle through treatment and relapse, and then watched her stabilise, and is now watching her work part-time and rent a flat. That story has no dramatic turning point. It has only duration, the accumulated weight of years of not giving up on both sides in a system that had been designed to keep the door open. 27. The architecture of shame and why it kills people. There is a mechanism in addiction that doesn't get discussed enough in policy circles, possibly because it is harder to measure than incarceration rates or HIV infections. Shame. Shame is, in the clinical literature on addiction, one of the most reliable predictors of poor outcomes. People who are ashamed of their addiction are less likely to seek help, less likely to disclose to healthcare providers, less likely to maintain consistent treatment engagement, and more likely to use alone, which is where overdose deaths happen. A system that criminalizes drug use is, structurally, a system that manufactures shame. When the state tells you that what you're doing is a crime, that you're a criminal for doing it, that the appropriate response to your situation is arrest and incarceration, it sends a message about your value and your prospects that penetrates far deeper than any specific legal consequence. The neuroscience of shame is, in some ways, as relevant to addiction policy as the neuroscience of dopamine, and considerably less discussed. Shame activates threat response systems in the brain that are fundamentally incompatible with the kind of open, help-seeking, socially connected behavior that recovery requires. A person endures. The grip of shame withdraws. They hide. They are less likely to answer the phone when a caseworker calls, less likely to keep an appointment at a clinic, less likely to tell a family member what is happening. The isolation that shame produces is not a character flaw. It is neurological response to perceived social threat, and in a system where disclosure of addiction could lead to arrest, prosecution, and social ostracism, that perceived threat was entirely accurate. This is why the language used by the state about addiction matters so much, and why Portugal's shift from criminal to medical framing was not merely symbolic. When the state's official position changes, from you are a criminal to you have a health condition, it does not immediately eliminate the shame that has accumulated over years of criminalization. Shame runs deeper than legislation. But it does begin to alter the social environment in which shame is produced and sustained. The official message that addiction is a health condition, repeated consistently through dissuasion commissions, through healthcare settings, through public information campaigns, through the behaviour of police officers who refer rather than arrest, that message accumulates. It creates small shifts in individual interactions that compound over time into something like a cultural change. Consider the practical difference in a healthcare setting. A person who believes that disclosing drug use to their doctor will result in judgment, referral to authorities, or loss of custody of their children will not disclose drug use to their doctor. A person who believes that disclosing drug use will result in a referral to a treatment program and a follow-up appointment is somewhat more likely to disclose. The difference between these two situations is not the person. It is the environment. Portugal changed the environment imperfectly and gradually, and people responded to the changed environment by behaving differently, by seeking help more, by staying engaged with services longer, by experiencing the system as something that was at least attempting to help them, rather than primarily attempting to punish them. Using alone, injecting drugs in private, without anyone present who could administer naloxone in the event of an overdose, is one of the most significant risk factors for overdose death. It is a behaviour driven substantially by shame and fear of legal consequences. The expansion of safe consumption sites, needle exchanges, and low-threshold health services in Portugal after reform reduced the conditions that made using alone the rational choice for many people. When the alternative to using alone is not arrest but access to clean equipment, health monitoring and human contact, some people choose the alternative. Not all, not immediately, but enough, consistently enough, to move the overdose death numbers in the direction they moved. 28. The neighbourhood that became a symbol, Castle Ventoso. If you wanted to understand what Portugal was trying to move away from, you went to Castle Ventoso, a neighbourhood in Lisbon that by the mid-90s had become so associated with the heroin epidemic that it functioned almost as a single sprawling open-air drug market. Thousands of people, users, dealers, people who had come from other parts of the country because Casal Ventoso was where the drugs were, occupied a hillside that journalists photographed and governments cited as evidence of total systemic failure. It was not, to be clear, a neighbourhood of strangers and criminals who had materialised from nowhere. It was a neighbourhood of people, many from economically precarious backgrounds, caught in the specific tragedy of addiction, intersecting with poverty in a city with no adequate response. Casal Ventoso had been a working-class neighbourhood for decades before the heroin arrived. It had a history, a community, a set of social relationships and local institutions that predated the crisis and were profoundly disrupted by it. The people who lived there who were not using drugs, the families, the elderly residents, the people who owned small businesses or maintained the social fabric of the neighbourhood, found themselves living alongside an open drug market in conditions that were difficult and often frightening. Their voices in the debate about what to do were frequently overlooked by a discourse that focused primarily on the users themselves or on the symbolic weight of Casal Ventoso as an image of national failure. The photographers who visited Casal Ventoso in the 90s captured images that became, internationally, shorthand for the Portuguese drug crisis and for a certain kind of Western drug crisis more broadly. Thin figures in doorways, syringes on the pavement, children navigating around adults who were insensible in public spaces. These images were powerful precisely because they were real, and they captured something true about the consequences of a crisis that had been building for over a decade in the absence of any adequate response. They were also, inevitably partial. They captured the most visually dramatic manifestations of the crisis, while the quieter suffering, the family dysfunction, and the healthcare burden and the economic devastation that extended far beyond those specific streets remained invisible. After 2001, Casal Ventoso became a different kind of story and a more complicated one, which is perhaps why it received less international attention than the earlier images had. The open drug market dispersed over several years, not through a single dramatic intervention, but through the gradual accumulation of treatment access, outreach services, and the reduction in active addiction that treatment produced. urban redevelopment followed the dispersal, new housing, new public spaces, a physical transformation of the neighbourhood that accompanied the social one. The change was real but uneven. Some residents who had lived through the worst years felt the transformation had displaced as much as it had improved, raising questions about who the renewal was for and whether the community that had survived the crisis was the community that got to benefit from its resolution. Today, Casal Ventoso is a neighbourhood in Lisbon that most tourists and many locals would not be able to identify by name. That anonymity is, in its own way, the most meaningful possible outcome, the return to ordinary, unremarkable urban life that was the whole point of the exercise. It is not a monument. It is not a cautionary tale. It is just a neighbourhood with residents and streets, and a history that includes one of the most visible chapters of a national crisis, and then the long, quiet work of coming back from it. 29. The people who still don't agree and why that matters. 25 years on from decriminalization, Portugal still has people, politicians, community leaders, religious groups, parents, who believe the reform was wrong and remains wrong. This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, because the concerns driving the opposition are not always irrational. Some parents of people who developed addiction disorders worry that decriminalization contributed to a cultural signal that drug use was acceptable and that this signal reached young people in ways that were harmful. Some community members in neighbourhoods that struggled with visible drug use feel that the health-focused model sometimes prioritised the user's experience over the quality of life of the surrounding community. Some religious and social conservative voices argue that the state's role should include a moral dimension that the clinical framing deliberately strips out. The parental concern is perhaps the most emotionally compelling and the hardest to argue with, because it comes from a place of genuine love and genuine loss. Parents who watched a child develop addiction in the years following reform, and there were many, because addiction did not stop happening, sometimes attributed that development to a policy environment that had, in their view, lowered the perceived consequences of experimentation. The argument is intuitive. If the government stops arresting people for drug use, young people will conclude that drug use is less serious than they previously believed, and some of those young people will experiment who otherwise would not have. The research does not strongly support this mechanism. The data on youth drug use in Portugal is mixed, but does not show the dramatic increases this theory would predict. But the research is not the experience of a parent who believes they know what happened to their child. The community concern is different in character, but also worth engaging honestly. Some neighbourhoods that had been most affected by the open drug markets of the 90s found, in the years after reform, that outreach services and treatment programs were concentrated in their areas in ways that maintained a visible association with drug use even as the crisis itself diminished. Low-threshold services specifically designed to be accessible to people who are actively using drugs, were often located in the same communities that had been most harmed by the epidemic. Residents who had lived through the worst years sometimes felt that their neighbourhood was perpetually defined by its association with the crisis, that the services designed to help drug users were in some ways a continued imposition on communities that had not chosen to host them and had not been adequately consulted about where they should be sited. The religious opposition was consistent and principled. Catholic social teaching, which remains influential in Portugal, as in most of southern Europe, emphasises the moral dimension of human choices in ways that the clinical framing of addiction deliberately sets aside. From a religious perspective, reducing harm without addressing the moral and spiritual dimensions of addiction treats the symptom while ignoring the cause, and a state that endorses treatment over moral accountability is, in this view, failing in one of its fundamental responsibilities. These are not arguments that empirical data can fully answer, because they rest on premises about the nature of human dignity and responsibility that are not empirically resolvable. They deserve to be heard as what they are, sincere moral positions with genuine philosophical content, rather than dismissed as ignorance or prejudice. What makes Portugal's experience genuinely instructive is that the reform held, and continued to hold, through all of this opposition. Not because the opposition was defeated or silenced, but because the evidence accumulated steadily enough and the outcomes improved visibly enough to maintain the political consensus necessary to sustain the policy. That is what democratic legitimacy looks like in practice, not unanimity, but a durable majority convinced by evidence and experience in ongoing conversation with a dissenting minority whose concerns are heard even when they don't ultimately prevail. 30. What you take with you when you finally fall asleep. Here you are, at the end of a story that started with a small country running out of options and ended, well, not ended because it's still going, but arrived at a place that feels, if not like resolution, then at least like meaning. Portugal did not solve the human relationship with substances. It did not eliminate addiction or suffering or the complicated reasons people reach for something that dulls the edges of a life that has too many edges. What it did was quieter and more durable. It changed the question. Not how do we punish this, but how do we help? Not what is the moral verdict, but what does the evidence say? Not who do we blame, but what do people need? And in changing the question, it changed the outcomes. Not for everyone, not immediately, not perfectly, but measurably and significantly, and in ways that the people it helped are alive to attest to. The story of Portugal's drug reform is, at its most fundamental, a story about what it means to take someone seriously. To look at a person in the grip of addiction, frightened, sick, often behaving in ways that are difficult and sometimes dangerous, and decide that the most important question is not what they deserve, but what they need. That is not a complicated idea. It is, in fact, the kind of idea that most people would endorse in the abstract, in a hypothetical. The difficulty is in the implementation, in building the systems, funding the services, maintaining the political will, and sustaining the patience required to act on that idea in the real world, with real people, over the long haul. Portugal built those systems, imperfectly, with setbacks, with ongoing arguments about funding and approach and scope, with austerity years that cut into the infrastructure and recovery years that rebuilt it, with a continuous stream of critics and a continuous accumulation of evidence, with bureaucrats and caseworkers and outreach workers and doctors and social workers who showed up every day to do unglamorous work in fluorescent-lit rooms and mobile health vans and community centres, not because it made headlines, but because it needed to be done. The people those workers served were not abstract beneficiaries of a policy experiment. They were people with names and histories and families, and this is the thing that the statistics can suggest but not quite capture: futures. People who were alive to have futures because the system treated them as worth the effort of staying alive. That sounds like a minimum. In the context of what the alternative produced, it was a revolution. So as the lights get lower and your breath gets slower, carry something from this story with you into sleep. Not the statistics, they'll be there tomorrow if you want them. Carry instead the image of that social worker in the small room, asking someone how they're really doing. Carry the needle exchange van in the rain. Carry Antonio, working his warehouse shift, unremarkable and alive. Carry the quiet, stubborn idea that the way a society treats the people who are struggling most says something definitive about what that society actually believes about human worth. Portugal didn't save everyone. No policy does. But it saved enough people, consistently enough for long enough, to demonstrate that a different approach was possible, that compassion and evidence, given half a chance and adequate funding, could outperform punishment and ideology on the very grounds that punishment and ideology claimed as their own. That is not nothing. In the long and mostly grim history of how human societies have responded to addiction, it is, in fact, quite a lot. Sleep well. The world is still figuring this out. But at least one small country on the edge of the Atlantic showed us which direction to look. And so here we are, at the quiet end of a very long and surprisingly hopeful journey through one of the strangest policy experiments in modern history. You came in wondering whether a country could legalise, or more precisely decriminalise, every drug without collapsing into chaos. And the answer, it turns out, is not only yes, but that the chaos was already there. And the decriminalisation was what began, slowly and imperfectly, and with considerable paperwork, to reduce it. Think about what Portugal's people lived through. The 90s were not gentle. Families watched relatives disappear into addiction, while a system that claimed to be responding arrested them, processed them, released them, and watched them return to the same streets unchanged. Neighbourhoods like Casal Ventoso became synonymous with everything that goes wrong when desperation meets scarcity, and the only official response is a pair of handcuffs. HIV moved through communities with an efficiency that should have been impossible in a modern European democracy. And through all of it, the people kept going. The users and the families and the social workers and the doctors and the ordinary residents of ordinary neighbourhoods who were simply trying to live their lives in the middle of someone else's crisis. There is a particular kind of resilience in that, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that gets photographed or turned into speeches, but the daily, grinding, unglamorous resilience of people who do not have the option of giving up. The Portuguese people who lived through the worst of that crisis, and the officials who were honest enough to admit the response was failing and courageous enough to try something genuinely different, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in a drug policy debate, but as people who changed something real for a lot of other people. They made the fluorescent lit room. They staffed it. They kept showing up. And the people who walked into those rooms, who sat across from three strangers and were asked, perhaps for the first time by any one official, how they were actually doing, those people deserve to be remembered too. Not as statistics, not as cautionary tales, not as the faces and the photographs that became international shorthand for a national crisis. As people. Complicated, struggling, sometimes infuriating, ultimately human people who needed a system to treat them as worth the effort, and in Portugal after 2001 found one. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth of a bed in a world that, for all its considerable problems, has indoor plumbing and clean water on tap and a healthcare system that, however imperfect, will not arrest you for being ill, maybe spare a thought for the people whose suffering became the evidence that changed a conversation, for the Antonio who made it to 32, for the Anna who finally called the number, for the children who grew up in households that were stable enough because someone got help, to give them something like a normal start. Because history is not made only by kings and generals and dramatic moments of visible turning. It is also made in small rooms, by quiet decisions, by the accumulation of individual choices to treat other people as worth the trouble of helping. Portugal made that choice. It was messy and expensive and politically contentious, and is still ongoing and still imperfect. It was also, by the evidence, right. The world is still arguing about this. The argument will continue long after you wake up tomorrow, well rested, having spent the night in the company of a story about what happens when a country decides that the point isn't punishment. The point is people. Good night. You did a good thing staying with this one to the end. Now let it go. Let the breath slow. Let the room get quiet. Let the story settle. Somewhere in Lisbon, a mobile health van is parked on a wet street. A social worker is filling out a form. A person who needed help found a door that was open. That's enough. That's more than enough. Sleep well. outro. And so here we are, at the soft, quiet edge of a very long night in Portugal, a country that looked at its own reflection in the late 1990s, did not like what it saw, and did something genuinely rare. It told the truth about it, and then tried something different. You've travelled, without leaving your bed, through the smoke-filled hovels of a heroin crisis that consumed 1 in every 100 people in a modern European democracy. You have sat in fluorescent-lit rooms where 3 strangers asked one exhausted person how they were really doing, and meant it. You have followed the needle exchange vans through rainy streets, walked the dispersing crowds of Casal Ventoso, watched the HIV numbers fall, and the prison population thin, and the treatment centres slowly, stubbornly, fill with people who had decided, or been gently persuaded, that their lives were worth the attempt at saving. It was not a glamorous story. That is probably the most important thing about it. There were no grand speeches at pivotal moments, no single hero whose vision transformed everything overnight, no dramatic before and after that you could photograph and frame. There was a commission of doctors and lawyers and social workers reading research in conference rooms. There were caseworkers helping people fill out forms for housing applications. There were pharmacists dispensing daily doses of medication to people who came back every morning, because the medication was helping and they needed it to keep helping. There were families, quietly, cautiously, beginning to believe that the person they loved might find their way back. That is what courage looks like when it is doing its actual work, as opposed to its performed version. It looks like showing up. It looks like keeping the door open even when the person you're keeping it open for has walked away from it before. It looks like building a system designed for the reality of how people recover, which is slowly, unevenly, with setbacks, over years, not for the narrative version, which is cleaner and faster and far more convenient. The people of Portugal who lived through the worst of that crisis, and the officials who chose honestly to confront it, deserve a kind of quiet gratitude that history does not always think to offer. They did not solve everything. They did not eliminate suffering or addiction or the complicated human tendency to reach for something that makes the harder parts of life feel briefly more manageable. But they reduced the dying. They reduced the imprisonment. They built something imperfect, contested, maintained through decades of political argument and budget cycles, and the relentless, unglamorous labour of people who chose healthcare over punishment, that worked well enough to matter, well enough to save lives that would otherwise not have been saved. So tonight, as you tuck yourself into the extraordinary luxury of a clean bed in a warm room, with water that will not make you sick available from a tap a few steps away, and a world outside that, whatever its failures, has not arrested you today for being human and struggling, maybe carry something small and true from this story into sleep. Carry the image of a social worker sliding a piece of paper across a table. Carry the methadone clinic opening its doors at 7 in the morning to people who came because they needed to and were not turned away. Carry Antonio, 32, unremarkable, alive. Carry the quiet, radical, evidence-backed idea that the most effective thing a society can do for its most vulnerable people is decide, and mean it, that they are worth helping. The world is still arguing about all of this. It will be arguing tomorrow, and the day after, and for many years to come. But one small country at the edge of the Atlantic spent 25 years demonstrating that a different approach was possible. The evidence is there, the door is open. Good night. Sleep deeply and gratefully and well.